Adam Elliot.
Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you. Sit down. Thank you.
And of course, Grace. I
Grace,
forgot to
yeah.
mention.
She hasn't got any legs, sorry.
Well, congratulations on a beautiful film. I have to tell you, as a twin myself, I was so profoundly moved by it, and yeah, it just hit me real deep. So thank you for sharing such a beautiful, tender film with us and with our audience. So tell me what inspired this story and how you first came up with it.
Well, I suppose when I start writing, and it has been a long time since my last feature film, Mary and Max, I did make a little short in between, but that was more of an experiment. For me to write, I have to get quite agitated and angry about something. And about 8 years ago, my father passed away and left behind a big pile of stuff, 3 sheds full of things, and my siblings and I had to start going through everything and throwing stuff out and donating things to charity. And I became fascinated with, why do people collect things? Why, as human beings, do we collect stuff that we don't need, like bowerbirds? Why do we fill our houses with stuff? And I started to read a lot of books on the psychology of hoarding, and the more research I did, the more I discovered that extreme hoarders have often suffered a lot of trauma in their lives, and more often than not, the loss of a sibling or a twin or a child. And so that really interested me. And at the same time, I was going through all my notebooks. I have very detailed notebooks going back many decades. And I was going to make a short film about a friend of mine who was born with a cleft palate. And I never got around to doing it, but I started to reread these notes I'd written about her life. And she had had a very traumatic childhood as well, and she had a lot of operations on her mouth, and was bullied and teased a lot at school. But then as an adult, became quite an extrovert, became quite a show-off, very confident, like a peacock. She was always first to take her clothes off at a party. She was very, flamboyant. And I thought, how did she transform from this little shy girl into this very confident adult? So I had these sort of 2 spheres of ideas going around. And so I just started writing. I had the urge to write. And 16 drafts later, I ended up with this. And I write in a very unconventional fashion, in that I start with the detail and not the structure of the story. I don't worry about the plot or the 3-act structure or the narrative. I just start with details. So I knew I wanted some guinea pigs mating, something like that. And I knew I wanted an elderly woman dancing semi-naked on a coffee table. And I thought, well, it's like ingredients for a cake. I just kept finding all these things. And then it's a matter of working out how to string all those things together and then get a rhythm and a tempo going. I always see a film as a bit like a symphony. I love classical music, and I always see that the beginning of the film, there's just a few instruments, and then you add more and more instruments, and it builds to a crescendo and a climax, and then it tailors off and finishes. So I have a very musical sort of sensibility about how films are created. They're very, very dense cakes as well. I cram a lot in there, because I always say that if you're not an emotional wreck by the end of one of my films, then I've failed as a director. And so I want you to leave the cinema exhausted.
So once that writing process is done, can you walk us through a little bit? Then there's the long process of the actual stop motion animation part, right? So what is that like for you as the director and the leader of that whole process?
Well, that's the thing, I often think, maybe I should just be a novelist and just write novels. The trouble with this is you finish writing and then you have to turn it into a film and spend another 5 years. And so in a nutshell, I'll just give you some facts and figures. It took 7 animators, 33 weeks to shoot the animation, and that each animator was doing between 5 and 10 seconds of animation per day, so it was very slow. It took 16 weeks to make everything, so what you just saw were about 200 characters, and that includes bees, dogs, anything with a heartbeat was considered a character. 200 of those, 200 sets, and we don't know, we never counted, but between 5 and 7,000 snails. So that took 16 weeks, and it took 6 months to edit it, get all the music composed and put together. But before that, I had to do the storyboard. So I hand drew 1,500 storyboard panels on bits of paper, and I did that in COVID. That took 4 or 5 months, I think. And then Melbourne had one of the longest COVID lockdowns in the world, so we were locked down for a long time. So then after the storyboard, I then went and drew all the characters, character design, and I drew all the sets, and then I drew all the props. There's another 5,000 drawings there, so I have a huge pile of drawings at home. I love drawing, so that's okay. So that was the process. It's a very slow, very expensive art form. Having said that, our budget was only $5 million American, and films like Pinocchio cost $80 million. And Leica, who are making a film at the moment, we were at the Leica studios a few days ago, who made Coraline and Paranorman and those films. Their budget's 200 million. So our budget's what they spent on catering.
Well, thank you for all of that information. So much to get into, but I'd love to open it up to our audience if you all have any questions. Yes, right there.
I just want to say, I just love this film, even more than Mary and Max, which I also love.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering, you have these 2 main characters who are kind of, sweet, but kind of, odd, strange young girls, awkward young girls, and then they connect with this older, eccentric, is there something in your childhood, or, is this from experience, or is this just complete invention to have these characters, or?
Yeah, well the question was, the dynamic between younger and older characters. Yeah, I do love, having lead characters who are very different. So my last film, Mary and Max, was between an 8-year-old girl and a 44-year-old man. But all my films are based on my family and friends, as I said. And I have a lot of elderly, not elderly women, but a lot of older friends who, a lot of my friends are older than I am. And I like hanging around with older people. I just find they're more free-spirited, they don't care as much about what people think, and a lot of them have had very eccentric, interesting lives. And Pinky's actually based on an American who now lives in my building in Melbourne, Australia. Her name's Pinky, and her family actually used to run the Ghirardelli Chocolate Company. So she's an influence, but also another woman, Nancy Phelps, who's also from San Francisco. She is a big animation buff and animation critic, and I met her at the Annecy Animation Festival many years ago, and she's had a very colourful life, and she told me that once she played ping pong with Fidel Castro, and she was also one of the founders of the Burning Man festival. So she's had a very colourful life, and I just love that dynamic. It's also, it's not just a one-way street where the younger person's learning wisdom from the older person, that the older person can also learn from the younger person, so, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Curious about the choice of the books. There seem to be a lot of classic books that they were reading, and is that intentional, and is there meaning behind that?
Yeah, so all the books in the film are books I've read, of course, and the books I'm sure you were all forced to read at school. Except the ginger chested pie and the heaving breasts. Oh, I forgot what it said. But also, I love reading, of course, and but also in the film, I wanted Gilbert and Grace that their father instills in them the importance of reading, and that no matter how down they are or lost or lonely, they can always escape into literature, and that's what Gilbert and Grace do. But unfortunately, Grace as an adult strays into romance novels, but she comes back to Anne Frank at the end. And and also in lockdown, I spent a couple of days just inventing all these fictitious books for the library scenes, and I love coming up with book titles. Jesus Ate My Cat was my favorite.
For one more, yes.
Okay, this is so impressive. I was just
Thank
gonna say
you.
that first. 6 months of storyboard is a lot, but I'm curious on each phase, like the challenges in terms of like the writing. I'm curious on the challenges during production, and kind of like what was the motivation to like get past that hurdle.
Sure. Question was the challenges of the writing, and that's where all the challenges for me as the creator of the whole thing is in the story. And I always tell students to not obsess about the animation, because my animation lecturer at film school, in the first couple of days, she said, I don't really care what you animate. You can animate Lego, you can animate plasticine, you can animate on a computer. She said, all I care about is your story. It's a good story, well told. And she said this thing that struck me. She said, an audience will always forgive bad editing, bad sound, bad acting, bad music, but they'll never forgive a bad story. So focus on the story, and if the rest isn't as good, that's okay. You'll get away with it because it's a good story, well told. And so that's what I've always focused on. And like I said, Grace doesn't have legs, and that's because we couldn't afford to do walking. Walking's very expensive, and that's why there's not much talking in the film. But the thing I didn't scrimp on was the writing. So it took 3 years to write. And the biggest challenge I had was getting that balance between the comedy and the tragedy, the light and the dark. Because at times I was worried it was getting too dark. And I think there's a point in the film where the audience are like, if something good doesn't happen to Grace soon, we're leaving. So then Ken magically arrives, but then Ken doesn't turn out to be so good. And, so it is that balance of light and shade. And I collect quotes. If anything I hoard, it's quotes. And one of my favourite quotes is, without the dark, the light has no meaning. So I really am quite cruel to my protagonists, and I really drag them through the mud. But then I reward them at the end. So for Grace, the reward is Gilbert coming back. But I didn't want Gilbert to come back to be, Grace isn't complete without a man in her life. I wanted Grace to be a complete person, get her life organised, become a successful stop-motion animator, and then Gilbert comes back as the reward. So originally Gilbert didn't come back either. He was dead. But I thought, no. And as I'm getting older too, I'm preferring to write happier endings. When I was a student, all my films were like David Lynch. They're all angst-ridden, and I thought, no, I've got to grow up and do something with a happy ending. So, happier ending. There's a high body count along the way.
Well, thank you so much. I think we could maybe continue the conversation in the lobby a bit, but I just want to make a note to please keep our voices down while we're out there. There's a pretty quiet film playing in the other theater, and the sound does bleed, so we could just be mindful of that. Thank you so much, Adam, Elliot.
Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you, Celeste, as well.